Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, an episode on Argentine political parties. So today's episode was requested by VUC Conservative Party, Sam Volkers, Nicole Zandi, and DL all on YouTube. If you want me to do another country's political parties, please either comment down below, send me an email, send me a message on Patreon from my patrons, shout out to them and especially Danny Brown by the way, or put a request in the feedback and request form in the description. I currently have requests to do Iranian parties, Armenian parties, Mexican parties, Czech parties, Iraqi parties, Singaporean parties, Swedish parties, Lithuanian parties, Finnish parties, Latvian parties, and many more. If you want to understand Argentine politics, you have to try to figure out what Peronism is. Peronism is named after Juan Domingo Perón, the president of the country from 1946 to 1955, and then again briefly from 1973 until his death a year later. Perón came to power as a member of a military dictatorship and came to power with the support of a diverse coalition of the working class, ex-socialist and syndicalist, progressive liberal-ish types, dissident elites, businessmen, academics, and military officers, Argentine nationalists, and opponents of the traditional conservative elites looking for a score to settle. He had a nationalistic and populist message that resonated with a large chunk of the Argentine people, and he remains one of the most imposing figures in Argentine history. So, you may be asking, okay Ryan, so it's nationalistic and populist? So it's like a right-wing ideology or something like that? Well, the fascinating thing about Peronism is that it's not really any one thing. There are Peronists across the political spectrum, ranging from far-left revolutionaries, to center-left reformers, to pro-status quo political elites, to far-right fascist. All of them will point out and cherry-pick certain aspects of Perón's policy and vision: his support for strong government industries, his closeness with unions, his hostility towards traditional elites, his third-way foreign policy, or his sympathies towards Mussolini's Italy, to argue for their own version of Peronism and what it means to be a Peronist. But broadly, all Peronists will argue along populist and anti-elitist lines and tend to lean somewhat nationalist and defend the legacy of Perón. These various Peronists are divided into many different factions. You have at the extremes Orthodox Peronism and Revolutionary Peronism, which represents the far right and far left of Peronism respectively. These factions, quite frankly, aren't that popular or widespread, except among a small circle of supporters with limited to non-existent electoral support. More prominent is Federal Peronism, which is more conservative and more often found in rural provinces outside the capital, being associated with figures like Carlos Menem, the president from 1989 to 1999. However, the largest branch of Peronism today is the Kirchnerist, named after Nestor Kirchner, the president from 2003 to 2007, and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, the president from 2007 to 2015. The Kirchnerists are a center-left group ranging from socialists to social democrats to left-leaning moderates, all generally being sympathetic towards both Kirchners and generally leaning left towards social and economic policy. Peronism isn't confined to any one party, with there being many Peronist parties and movements found throughout the country. That being said, the largest Peronist party, and the largest party in Argentina itself, is the Justicialist Party, or Partido Justicialista, or PJ. The PJ was founded in 1946, shortly after Perón came into office, and has been the leading Peronist force ever since, although at times banned and repressed. It has fairly consistently, since the return of democracy in 1983, been the first or second most voted for party, being a dominant political force in the country. However, it has been continuously weakened by factionalism within the party, as right and left-wing Peronists have pulled the party in different directions, and provincial breakups of the party being quite common. It remains today the largest party in Congress, with over 35% of the seats being PJ members, and another 10% of Congress being made up of other Peronist or Peronist-adjacent parties. Because of the massive divides that take place within the PJ, and to a lesser extent among some of the other parties in the country, Argentine politics aren't really grouped into parties. Instead, they are grouped into large-scale coalitions who are more ideologically cohesive. This isn't to say that they are free from infighting, but they can be more easily defined into a, spoiler alert for the rest of the episode, a Kirchnerist camp, a center-right camp, a populist right camp, two small federal Peronist camps, and then an even smaller socialist camp, that are more readable and easier to follow. Also important to note, Argentine coalitions are sprawling coalitions made up of many parties and personalities. One coalition we will talk about later is, if counting only parties with a presence in the national legislature, made up of 19 different parties. Why Argentine coalitions are made up of so many different parties seems to be to serve as different ideological wings within a coalition, i.e. representing the principled or pragmatic wing, serving as power bases for certain figures within the coalition, helping capture and involve new unaligned people into the coalition, and or to serve as provincial wings of major national parties. Provincial wings leads us to talking about Argentina's political structure, so let's begin discussing that. Argentina is a federation made up of 23 provinces plus the autonomous city of Buenos Aires, which essentially serves as its own province. Each province has its own elected governor, which I will mention throughout the episode. Importantly, there exists fairly distinct regional differences between the provinces and among political elites between the provinces, as some parties dominate politics in their province, so much so that they can form their own political dynasties, ruling over their province for several decades at a time. We may as well also discuss Argentina's unique electoral system for president. Argentina uses essentially a 3-round voting system. The first round is the primary, which determines which candidate actually makes it on to the official round of voting. In order to get past the primary, a candidate needs to both beat all other candidates within their electoral bloc and get at least 1.5% of the vote in order for their presidential candidate to make it onto the first round of voting. Then, in the first round, a candidate needs to get 50% of the vote to win. If no candidate gets over 50% of the vote, the 2 most voted for candidates then go on to a second round of voting, and whoever gets the most votes there will win the presidency. Argentina's legislature is the National Congress, which is made up of 2 bodies. The lower body is the Chamber of Deputies, which is made up of 257 deputies. Every 2 years, half of the chamber is elected via proportional representation from the 24 provinces, with the most populous province, the Buenos Aires province, not the actual city, sending 70 deputies, with the 10 least populous provinces sending only 5 deputies. The deputies will vote on rules and regulations and will receive referendum initiatives. The upper house is the Senate, which is made up of 72 senators. Each province sends 3 senators, with 1/2 of the Senate being up for election every 2 years. Senators are elected from a kind of funky system. Whatever party or electoralist gets the most votes will elect 2 senators, while the second most voted for party/electoralist will elect only 1. The Senate will also vote on rules and regulations like the chamber, and will approve the presidency's appointments for the executive branch, judges, ambassadors, and heads of the military. Also important to note, certain actions like the impeachment of president or the creation of new taxes has to start in the chamber and then goes up to the Senate. Argentina's Congress is modeled like the American Congress, with the lower body representing the people, while the Senate is supposed to represent the states or provinces. I suspect that, like America, Argentine senators are considered more prestigious than deputies, since their terms are longer and there's less of them, so therefore their vote has more influence. Also important to note that, like America, Argentina is under a presidential system, with the president as the most important political figure, but still not able to entirely dominate the country without the help of the legislature. Finally, before we begin, Argentina is a member of the Southern Common Market, or Mercosur. Mercosur, like the EU, has a parliament which is elected. Argentina sends 43 members to the Mercosur parliament, with 19 being elected via the national vote, while 24 are elected from the provincial vote, with each province sending only 1 MP. It seems the Mercosur parliament doesn't really have a massive role to play within the bloc, serving as an advisory role, even more so than the EU parliament, although it is another electoral theater for Argentine parties to flex their muscles in, and gets its members elected into political office. So let's actually start looking at the political blocs. First off, we have the largest bloc in the Congress, the Union for the Homeland, or Unión por la Patria, or UP. The UP can be defined as either the Peronist, or Kirchnerist, or just center-left camp in the country. It is generally made up of those supportive, or at least sympathetic towards, Nestor and Cristina Kirchner's vision of Argentina, with a coalition able to trace its origins to the Front for Victory, a coalition of parties that helped Nestor take power in 2003, Cristina take power in 2007 and 2011, and then Alberto Fernandez, a on-again, off-again ally and foe to the Kirchners, in 2019. UP itself was formed in 2023 in the run-up to the elections later that year, which they emerged still as the largest party in Congress, although having lost seats in the chamber and having lost the presidency. I'll talk later about the problems plaguing the coalition that have caused it in recent years to enter into a decline, but just know right now the coalition itself, despite its size, isn't really the dominant force in Argentina right now. UP's support base isn't exactly a one-to-one recreation of Perón's support base of the 40s and 50s, but it is similar, being supported by unions, especially those associated with the General Confederation of Labor, a decent chunk of progressive social activists, and among those supportive of more government involvement in the economy. It generally does best in areas right outside the city of Buenos Aires and in the north, especially in Santiago, Formosa, and Misiones. It also has historically done better in the far south and east in poor regions of the country, although this has somewhat changed last election. It currently has 100 deputies, 33 senators, 8 governors, and sends 21 members to Mercosur Parliament. UP is like Peronism, itself a divided group, with both federal Peronists and Marxist-Leninists found within the coalition. However, the vast majority of its members are a part of the PJ, with most being Kirchnerist, or at least not outright antagonistic towards them. Other smaller groups do exist as well and can play a much bigger role in certain provinces. The second biggest party within the UP is the Renewal Front, a federal Peronist party headed by Sergio Massa, the former Minister of the Economy and UP's presidential candidate in the latest election. There are some dissident members of the Radical Civic Union, or UCR, a party who we'll talk about more with the next coalition. There is the New Encounter Party, a Kirchnerist/progressive party found mostly in the greater Buenos Aires area, the Solidarity Party, a socialist party, the Frente Grande Front, a third worldist/Catholic/Latin American nationalist leftist party, the National Alfonsist movement, a center-left breakoff of the UCR, and the Coloni Party, a Kirchnerist party mostly based in the Santa Cruz province and headed by Elisa Kirchner, the sister of Cristina Kirchner. About a dozen other parties are affiliated with the party, but they have less than 2 members of Congress and are either relegated to just one province or are much more on the sidelines. Since UP is a grand coalition of many different parties, figuring out what their exact policies are can be a bit confusing. However, since it's generally a Kirchnerist group, they tend to be economically interventionist, socially progressive, and sympathetic towards left-wing states and leaders in Latin America. The Kirchners, when in office, backed nationalization, supported a strong welfare state, sought to gain more support to those working in informal sectors of the economy, wanting to reduce economic inequality, was sympathetic towards unions, and generally favored populist economic policies. Socially, it tends to back LGBTQ rights, is pro-choice, is secular, and wants to punish those who committed war crimes in Argentina's dictatorship in the 70s and 80s. In terms of foreign policy, the Kirchners and their allies favored closer relations with places like Venezuela, Brazil under Lula, Iran, and China, while growing hostile towards right-wing Latin American states like Paraguay or Brazil under Bolsonaro and the UK, along with also being hostile towards the IMF, and while not necessarily antagonistic towards America, tends to be somewhat critical towards the US and its policy in the region. UP is the largest coalition in the Congress, but it is in a very rough position of being hated by just about all the other factions. The right tends to view the coalition and just Peronists in general as incompetent administrators who don't know how to actually run the country, with inflation rising during their rule. Their populist policies may win elections, but they are seen by anti-Peronists as having little backbone, being just rhetoric, and loyalty to the Kirchners, who seem to be the only real inspiring figures in the coalition at the national level. One piece talking about Mesa actually does a pretty good job at highlighting how certain members of UP, as vultures who will chase trends to remain popular and only real goal is to remain in political power. Quote, that ability to change ships before bad weather sets in is key to their political survival. Mesa has been a Menemist, a dualdist, a Kirchnerist, an anti-Kirchnerist, and once again a Kirchnerist. This volatile ideology never distracted him from the ultimate goal, to be president, unquote. So you can kind of see in that Mesa is changing his political camp just to survive with the times. Opponents of Peronism also see the party as being a kind of personality cult towards the Kirchners or Peron and being fairly corrupt. It seems while Nestor had a somewhat positive legacy, Cristina, perhaps owing to her longer time in public office and still being alive, is seen as this very power-hungry and corrupt figure by her enemies and a decent chunk of the Argentine media. The coalition, being a very broad range of groups, also frequently suffers from infighting between its various factions, competing over how radical they should be and how they should feel about the Kirchners, and breakoffs are quite common, as you will see later. Federal Peronists see the UP and Kirchnerists as too populist, unrealistic, and left-wing, while Marxists opposed to the coalition see them as failing to actually challenge the status quo of the country. They also tend to have a very conspiratorial outlook towards any criticism they receive, seeing it as a ploy by the media or traditional elites to discredit them. All these factors have led the party to suffer in recent elections, with the last 2 elections seeing significant losses to their opponents and a weakening and fracturing of their traditional support base. Despite all of this, however, the coalition remains a powerful player in Argentine politics, with the UP being the largest or second largest player in just about every region of the country. Having a very powerful political organization and a decent chunk of the electorate being die-hard loyalists of the coalition and its principles despite all the challenges over the years. The second largest player in Congress is the Together for Change coalition, or Juntos por el Cambio, or JXC. JXC represents the traditional center-right opposition to the Kirchners, being founded in 2015 as a coalition of three liberal and conservative parties wanting to unite together to defeat the Kirchners in the presidential election later that year. They won in 2015, with Mauricio Macri taking the presidency, breaking the Kirchners' hold on the office. They, however, lost in 2019, and while they had a brief revival in 2021, this latest election saw the party struggle quite a bit, with them retaining their second largest position in Congress almost entirely due to Argentina's tiered electoral system. Post-election, JXC somewhat imploded, with the coalition officially breaking apart, although I will still talk about them as a bloc, just because it's easier to group them all together that way. The JXC support base has historically consisted of both the wealthy and middle class in the country. Geographically, their support base is very heavily concentrated in Buenos Aires proper. They historically did well in the central, richer provinces, but this somewhat disappeared last election. They also do somewhat better in the north. They are overall the coalition for those hostile towards Peronism and back a center-right, pro-business, often technocratic government. It currently has 73 deputies, 20 senators, 10 governors, and sends 6 members to Mercosur Parliament. Within JXC, there are two dominant parties, the UCR and the Republican Proposal, or PRO. The UCR is probably the oldest party in the country today, having existed since the late 1800s, serving as liberal opposition to the conservative elite. It was the party for the middle class, Catholic activist, and dissident political elites. It over the years slowly became more popular and ruled the country in the 1910s and 20s. It lost power after a coup by the military in 1930, but continued to serve as an important political force, serving as the largest opposition party, although still operating in Argentina's repressive political system in the 30s and 40s, which led to it losing a lot of support to the more radical Peronists in the 40s. After the military dictatorship in the 80s, it emerged as one of, if not the largest anti-Peronist party in the country. PRO was formed in 2010 as a merger of several conservative groups representing center-right pro-market forces in the country. While it wasn't necessarily the largest party in the coalition, it seems to be the more dominant party, maybe owing to the UCR being divided between its various factions ranging from anti-Peronist social democrats to conservatives, while PRO is more ideologically centered around pro-business conservatives. Since JXC has somewhat imploded, several parties have joined other coalitions, but there are still a couple smaller parties that can fall under the JXC label, most notably the Production and Labor Party, a conservative party based in San Juan province. JXC is liberal economically, generally conservative socially, and pro-American. It supports lower taxes, a business-friendly Argentina, opposes nationalization, backs free trade, wanting to reduce trade tariffs, and generally supports orthodox economic procedures. Socially, the coalition was more divided, but most members were pro-life and supported a strong police force. Macri's foreign policy saw Argentina move towards America and embrace organizations like the IMF and the Lima Group. It supported the Áñez government in Bolivia, opposed the Venezuelan government, is hostile towards the Iranian government, blaming them for the AMIA bombing in the 90s, and generally was friendly with right-wing governments and movements in Latin America. JXC and Macri is seen by a decent chunk of the population as a movement that was first and foremost for the rich and elite in the country, and not for the average Argentine. Its economic liberalism and dominance in rich provinces such as Buenos Aires meant it was seen as the party not for the working class, but rather the rich and powerful. Its left-wing opponents saw it as a coalition that was soft in those that worked with the dictatorship in the 70s and 80s, regressive, puppets of the Americans, and out of touch with what a lot of Argentines want. Historically, the right backed the coalition, but after Macri failed to curb inflation in the late 2010s, which many right-wingers blamed on Macri not going far enough in economic liberalism, right-wing opponents to JXC began to emerge. After this latest election, the radical right under Javier Milei won the presidency. JXC, while it didn't completely crumble, did do very poorly in the seats it contested. This led to tension in the JXC as parts of it wanted to work with Milei, while others were more resistant. JXC has broken apart and the coalition itself dissolved, with PRO aligning themselves with Milei while UCR put themselves at arm's length, and other members of the coalition joined other groups. 2023 likely killed JXC as a cohesive force. Those in the coalition who like Milei will likely be forced to hitch themselves to his wagon, and likely be absorbed into his loyalists, while those skeptical of him will likely either fade away or join other political blocs in order to retain their relevancy. So those are the two largest blocs in the legislature, but actually the leading coalition in the country, by virtue of holding the presidency, is the coalition Freedom Advances, or La Libertard Avanza, or LLA. The LLA is a very young coalition, tracing its origins to the 2021 legislative election. It was formed as an alliance of several libertarian/right-wing parties. It managed in 2021 to get several members elected, most notably Javier Milei. Milei is a rather eccentric figure. He famously was known as Chainsaw Man, dressed as anarcho-capitalist man for Comic-Con, allegedly talks to his dead dog, and has a hairstyle that several have labeled as very Welsh, which I will say is some devastating criticism of him. But he also has done a very good job marketing himself as an anti-establishment, anti-Peronist, and populist libertarian figure. He presented himself as someone who would fundamentally transform Argentina and would, unlike other politicians, embrace a small government, directly confront the political elites, and would oppose woke or leftist policies. In the 2023 election, Milei did surprisingly well and actually managed to win the second round with 55.6% of the vote. While, as stated earlier, members of PRO are working with the new government and occupy several ministerial positions, most positions are occupied by LLA-affiliated members. Milei and the LLA was supported by younger voters, men, and geographically did best in poorer provinces, generally in the West. You will also find a lot of his supporters tended to be very vocal online. It paradoxically did well among both the ultra-wealthy of the country, but also the poorest people in Argentine society. It was supported by those who want someone who will dramatically change the country, and also among more libertarian and right-wing populist types inspired by his more confrontational style. It currently has 42 deputies, 7 senators, and sends 14 members to Mercosur Parliament. LLA is a coalition that's very disorganized. While UP has the PJ, and JXC has PRO and UCR, LLA doesn't really have a single party that dominates. Maybe you could say the Libertarian Party of Milei is a leading party since he is president, but it isn't even the largest party in the coalition. Instead, the largest party in the Congress is the Democratic Party, a neoconservative party that has existed in some form since the 30s, serving as an important figure in the ruling conservative coalition that dominated the country in 30s and early 40s. Other parties in the LLA are the Federal Renovation Party and the Faith Party, 2 right-wing Peronist parties, the Integration and Development Party, a party heavily influenced by ex-president Arturo Frondizi, the now Homeland Party, a far-right party based in Salta, and the Action for a New Democracy Party, a regional party based in San Juan. Besides that, there are also a high number of small parties and unaffiliated politicians associated with the coalition. LLA is broadly a right libertarian movement, supports less government in the economy, although still leaning conservative in social matters. Milei has pushed for austerity measures, wanted to cut down on government spending, supports privatization, wants to reduce the number of ministries in the cabinet, wanted to cut bureaucratic red tape, was hostile towards unions, and has historically campaigned on dollarizing the economy. Socially, Milei opposes abortion, has pushed for a sympathetic look at the military dictatorship, supports a strong police force, and other members of the LLA are seen as hostile towards LGBTQ rights and increased immigration. However, Milei and the LLA do have a more libertarian streak, with it favoring the legalization of drugs, is pro-gun rights, and wants to legalize the selling of human organs. In terms of foreign policy, it also favors closer relations with America, Israel, and the UK, wanting a peaceful solution to the Falklands conflict, while also wanting a more antagonistic policy towards China, Venezuela, and Brazil under Lula. It also seems the coalition views the election process in Argentina with skepticism, as on their webpage they have a whole section talking about how to be an election watcher. Milei is like many right-wing anti-establishment figures, a very polarizing person. Among his supporters he is loved, but his opponents see him as a demagogue, someone who will say outrageous things just to bring attention to himself, and regularly engages in bombastic ways on culture war type topics. I also know recently Milei went to Spain and criticized the wife of the Spanish Prime Minister, which caused a diplomatic crisis between the two, which I think his opponents will point at and say, him being confrontational will create problems that previously weren't there. His economic policy, much like JXC, is seen as being an economic policy that benefits the rich but hurts the poor. Milei is seen just by many on the left as essentially just another Macri, except more eccentric and fronting as a populist when he actually governs mostly the same as the traditional center-right. This isn't helped by JXC members being a part of Milei's cabinet. Milei is basing a lot of his presidency around a form of neoliberal shock treatment that will hurt the country in the short term by cutting government spending, but theoretically will help manage the debt, grow GDP, and reduce inflation in the long term. This, if it works, could mean Milei will become a hero in Argentine history. However, if it fails to work, then Milei could be seen as a failure and someone who furthered the crisis Argentina is in economically and who put even more pressure on the Argentine people. It also doesn't help Milei that in the legislature, he doesn't hold a majority. So he can either not compromise and potentially struggle or even fail to get his policies passed, which he could blame on his opponents, but that only goes so far, especially with his support base who wants to see change and not politicking, or he can compromise, something that he's pretty vocally said can't be done and maybe fail to fully carry out his plan. In the past couple of weeks, large-scale protests have broken out against his neoliberal policies, with tens of thousands marching in the streets. Right now, it seems Milei still has a large chunk of the population backing him, but if he can hold on to that over the next couple of years remains to be seen. Finally, I just want to mention that I apparently found out that a group of Peruvian shamans had predicted that Milei would end up failing due to their reading of cocoa leaves and flowers. Admittedly, an eccentric piece of news related to him, but Milei also is an eccentric guy, so it seems a bit fitting. From very exciting figures, we go to the much more, well, either mellow or boring figures, with the We Make Federal Coalition, or Hacemos Coalición Federal, or HCF. HCF is an alliance formed in the legislation created after the latest presidential election. It was formed from ex-JXC members, breaking off from their coalition and joining the We Do For Our Country Coalition, or HNP. The HNP was formed in 2021, serving as a coalition for federal Peronist, several regional-based groups, and parties that oppose Kirchner's populism but also JXC's more right-wing stance. The HNP and the HCF, while it does have members who lean more strongly either left or right, overall broadly represents the political center of the country. The HNP in the last election got the most support in its stronghold of Cordoba. It also did better in provinces broadly around Cordoba and Tierra del Fuego in the far south. It currently has 23 deputies, 7 senators. The governor of Cordoba, Martín Yayorda, is affiliated with the coalition and sends one member to the Mercosur parliament. While it is pretty small compared to the other coalitions we have talked about, it is pretty diverse in terms of parties within it. It has several PJ members within its ranks, many coming from the PJ branch in Cordoba. There is the Civic Coalition, ARI, a liberal party historically associated with the JXC. Hi, editing Ryan from the future. I just wanted to note the Civic Coalition actually broke off from the HCF a little bit ago, I think April 30th. The CC, due to kind of disputes with the larger coalition over, it seems like a trade union agreement, they have broken off and they're now their own thing now. Besides that, there are also members of PRO and UCR who broke off from their JXC counterparts. The Socialist Party, a centre-left party historically powerful in the 1910s and then again in the years following the dictatorship, but have fallen from relevancy in recent years. The Federal Republican Encounter, an orthodox Peronist party, and then several other small, mostly regionalist outfits. Because the HCF is just a parliamentary group, it isn't 100% clear what they stand for. I'm guessing it probably opposes grand changes in Argentina and supports some sort of mixed economy just because it's a centrist group. The HMP, when campaigning in 2023, fought for reducing government waste, although not supporting full-on privatization, and wanting to spend more on healthcare, reforming the tax relationship between the federal and provincial governments, and wants to get more women into the workforce. The HCF is a party for the federal Peronist and their allies, which, while they are still certainly present in the country, is, compared to the other coalitions we have talked about, just a much smaller force. In the last presidential election, the 3 previous coalitions I talked about all got over 20% of the vote in the first round, and the UP even got over 35% of the vote. Meanwhile, the HMP's candidate got a little under 7% of the vote. In legislative elections, it was even worse, with HMP-aligned candidates only able to get elected in 2 provinces, and the HMP not even bothering to contest most provinces. The federal Peronist movement is really only relevant in a couple of provinces and can't really compete on the national level. The new JXC politicians who help form the HCF may help the coalition in the next election reach a more wider national audience, but the HCF is right now really only a parliamentary alliance and serves to mostly help its members get seats on committees and isn't a fully functional political bloc. I'd imagine if it tried to become a nationwide movement, it would suffer from infighting between its various factions who range from far-right Peronists to social democrats, progressives seeing them as just another right-wing anti-Kirchnerist force, while the right could see them as just a bunch of Peronists who don't actually believe in anything. There's also another federal Peronist bloc in the legislature. The Federal Innovation Bloc, or Innovación Federal, or IF, was formed like the HCF in the aftermath of the last election. It was formed from some of the more right-leaning groups in UP, breaking off and forming their own political bloc. It seems to belong to a bloc of parties in the legislature known as the Dialogist, parties that aren't a part of Milei's coalition, but are willing to work with him on certain policies. Other Dialogist groups include the HCF and parts of the JXC that aren't directly affiliated with Milei's government. It currently has 9 deputies, 3 senators, and the governors of Misiones and Rio Negro are affiliated with the bloc. While the HCF is unlikely to become a major national player, it's pretty much impossible for the IF to become a major player, since they are really made up of solely regional outfits. The largest party in the coalition is the Party of Social Concord, a regional Peronist party from Misiones. There are also PJ members from Salta. There's the Together We Are Rio Negro, a regional Peronist party from Rio Negro, the Neuquén People's Movement, a regional Peronist party from, you guessed it, Neuquén, and the Salta Unites Us Party, a regionalist outfit from Salta. The last national coalition we will talk about is the Workers' Left Front, Unity, or Frente de Izquierdas y de los Trabajadores Unidad, or FITU. FITU is a coalition of several Trotskyist parties, although only two have representation at the national level. There is the Socialist Workers' Party, and then the Workers' Party. The Workers' Party was formed before the dictatorship of the 70s and 80s, and then re-emerged in the 90s, while the Socialist Workers' Party was formed after the dictatorship. FITU was formed in 2011 as a merger of the two parties and several other smaller Trotskyist groups in order to better pull their resources together for the primary elections in the country. It has made some gains over the years, but is like the HCF, a much smaller party in the country when compared to the larger blocs like the UP or LLA. It's overall the party for devout Trotskyist or Marxist, those who feel the UP is too moderate, or as a left-wing protest against the status quo. It gets the most support among younger voters, particularly college students, among cultural figures, and in certain non-Peronist unions. It geographically gets the most support in the Greater Buenos Aires area, Hui, and Neuquén. It currently has 5 deputies. FITU is a Marxist party, so it's economically leftist and progressive socially. It wants to fight entrenched union bureaucracy, opposes labor reform, opposes the privatization of mental health facilities, opposes foreign companies like Monsanto's involvement in the agricultural sector, wants to make sure property fees do not go over 25% of a family's income, wants to raise the minimum wage, and wants to nationalize the banks. Socially, it wants to build up mental health infrastructure in the country, supports LGBTQ rights, wants to decriminalize drug use, opposes police brutality, wants to do more to fight femicide in the country, and supports a quota where 5% of all jobs will be held by someone with a disability. It is also pro-Palestinian, is hostile towards Argentina's primary system, and opposes paying foreign debt Argentina has. FITU, while it is a player in the country, it isn't really that imposing of a force. It, outside of about 5 states, is either almost irrelevant to just non-existent. While the same can probably be said for the HCF, at least the HCF does have provinces like Cordoba, where it is dominant. FITU is dominant really nowhere, only loses slightly less in some parts of the country. FITU being the most left-wing coalition in the legislature means it's viewed by pretty much everyone else as a radical, unrealistic party that's impossible to work with. I'd imagine that the UP might see them as wreckers, as they do criticize unions UP is close with, and since they are a Trotskyist party, they may be viewed by other rivaling Marxist outfits as kind of a strange, bizarre bloc. People who don't fully understand Marxism are consumed by infighting and or are like secret CIA agents or something like that. Trotskyism, for some reason, tends to get a lot of these accusations thrown at it. FITU, while they do play a role in the country's politics, just aren't that powerful. So briefly before we end, I'll go over 2 regionalist outfits. First, we have the We Are Energy to Renew Santa Cruz, or Somos Energía para Renovación Santa Cruz, or SER. SER was formed in 2019 and is unsurprisingly found in Santa Cruz. It is based around Claudio Vidal, a trade unionist, then deputy, and current governor of the province. Vidal is a federal Peronist, having clashed with the Kirchner's wing of the party, saying Santa Cruz needs to rely less on the state and wants to fight corruption. It right now is a very dominant player in the province, effectively controlling it. It seems to get the most support along the coast of Santa Cruz. It currently has 2 deputies, 2 senators. Vidal is of course the governor of the province, and sends 1 member to Mercosur Parliament. Finally, we will end with the Salta Identity movement, or Partido Identidad Salteña, or PAIS. PAIS was formed in 2014 to serve as the political vehicle for Gustavo Sáenz, a, at the time, former PJ senator. In 2015, he became the mayor of the city of Salta with the support of federal Peronists, which he held up until 2019, when he, with the aid of JXC, managed to win the governorship race, with Sáenz being the province's current governor. He seems to be a generally right-leaning politician, but he isn't fully tied to any one group, being a classic Peronist, someone who is willing to change affiliation depending on the winds of the country. Also, apparently, he frequently publicly humiliates himself for problems in the province. PAIS isn't a massive party in the country, and it and the SER party aren't really super important to remember if you want a basic overview of the country's politics, but they do help highlight how certain regionalist outfits can really dominate certain regions of the country. or at the very least can play a very important role in certain provinces. So those are the parties of Argentina. In conclusion, there is the UP, a coalition of Peronists, specifically Kirchnerists and generally progressives, the JXC, an ex-coalition of the traditional center-right with liberals and conservatives under its banner, the LLA, the ruling coalition of broadly right-wing populists but also libertarians, conservatives, and other right-leaning groups, and then the smaller groups of the HCF, a coalition of Peronists, this time federal Peronist and broadly centrist, IF, another small federal Peronist coalition, and then there's the FITU, a Trotskyist coalition, and along with that, some other smaller regionalist players. The big ones to remember are UP, JXC, and LLA, and then also remember more on the sidelines, there's the federal Peronist and the Trotskyist. The impact Peron and Peronism has and continues to have on Argentine politics and parties plays a very major role in the country, and it makes populism a very powerful force in the country, helping make it unique. So yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching. I hope you all appreciate it. I hope you all especially appreciate my fact about the Peruvian shamans. I think that was, out of everything I learned in this video, that one was the one that I think will stick with me. If you know I'm going to do another country's political parties up next, and you know of any Peruvian shamans or just shamans in general that are bewitching certain political figures in the country, please let me know. I would love to make a note of that. But yeah, up next I will do a episode talking about what a country is and how our definitions are kind of complicated and often kind of incomplete in many ways. And then I will do the history of Cote d'Ivoire, and then I will do Iranian political parties. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.